Windows is getting worse, and more people are starting to look for viable alternatives. And that means many people are looking at Linux as possible alternatives. And so the question is, what types of things might you want to know before switching to Linux? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome back to Switch to Linux, where we talk about switching to Linux, free and open source software, privacy, and other things related to the computer world and our emerging systems where everything is being collected, everything is being stored. And I just want to teach you about the beauty of having a computer that you control without throwing ads at you at every single turn. So today we are going to be talking about the things that you should know before trying to switch to Linux. We're going to be as honest with these as we can. Some of these are good things, some of these are bad things, some of these are things you just need to know, or I wish someone would have told me because I didn't know anybody that actually knew anything about Linux when I switched. I had to learn it all on my own. So if you like this type of content, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please feel free to do that now and leave us a like and a comment down below. Now, before we get into this, several things between Windows and Linux are very similar as far as just basics of files. Now, of course, as the world is becoming more cloud-based, we're getting some divergence if you're focusing more on an offline type approach. Now, as far as keeping local files on your computer, this is very similar. In fact, the Windows approach was borrowed from Linux. You'll find that a lot of newer features in Windows are actually from Linux. So back a long time ago, they didn't necessarily have as cohesive of a structure to say your photos are here and your videos are here and your documents are here. Linux was doing that from a long time ago. And it wasn't until I think it was Vista or something that Windows started really doing that a whole lot. I don't remember at XP. Maybe I just didn't do that in XP. But where files are stored, Linux has a lot of the same functions. You open up your home folder and you have inside of there, you have a documents folder, you have a picture folder, you have a music folder, you have a video folder, you have a shared folder, you'll have a templates folders. Things like this are very similar there too. And so those are fairly similar. Most of the basic commands, like shortcut commands, are going to be essentially the same. Now, this will slightly change based on the desktop environment you're using. We'll get into that a little bit here, but in short, Linux itself is a kernel. Technically, if you get into some of the more hardcore Linux guys, they'll say it's GNU Linux. And that just means that Linux is the underlying kernel that runs the base level of the operating system. The GNU part is the user interface. The cool thing about Linux is there are multiple user interfaces. If you want to do something super new and modern, GNOME is one of the better models to do that. KDE Plasma allows you to do a lot of different varieties of different setups. I like the traditional Windows-like layout of Cinnamon. There's also XFCE, Mate, there's Budgie, and there's things that are called simple window managers instead of full desktop environments that allow you to do mostly short codes and things to get stuff done in a form of GUI. There's so many options inside of this. But as far as your basic commands, your control cut, your control paste, these types of things, eventually you have things much the same. And so depending on which distro you choose, if you choose the one that I recommend, which is Linux Mint, you're going to have a very familiar experience no matter what the case is. But there are certainly some differences and things that you might want to know. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to start in looking at some of these differences, and I have 5 key points. So let's go ahead and get into number 1, which is hardware. Hardware on Linux is a little bit different than hardware on Windows. In many instances, it is infinitely easier to deal with. On Windows, you generally have to install the system and then install a bunch of drivers. Now, modern iterations of Windows have once again borrowed from Linux and have a base set of drivers installed that will make installing your system fairly easy. In Linux, all of those drivers are generally built into the code. And so, effectively, you just pick your computer, you install Linux, and everything works out of the box. The exceptions you are going to have are if you have a circumstance where you have very custom hardware, you have some weird, obscure device that is a niche item. You're going to have a situation whereby Linux may not run that, or it may run it better. You have to check the manufacturer on some of those things. You have your standard off things that are not totally unique, but not totally rare. And those are things like drawing tablets, Wacom drawing tablets. Some distributions handle those a lot better than others. That's usually boils itself actually down to the desktop environment. GNOME and Cinnamon handle those really well. Mate, not so much. And so you have to take an element of this. Also, you have to consider how new the hardware is. Linux classically has worked on older hardware a lot better than newer hardware. This is something that is changing a lot more as the kernel development moves a little bit faster, and it brings to it a little bit more stability. But when you are dedicating yourself to run Linux, rather than running out and buying a computer, you will probably need to do a little bit more research. So if I'm going into a store, like as I'm traveling around the country, I might see a pawn shop. Let's walk in a pawn shop. Ooh, there's a computer. It's pretty cheap. I'm going to look at the basic specs of the computer. I might throw that thing on a search engine like, Start Page or Brave or DuckDuckGo, not Google, but I'm going to go ahead and use one of these search engines. I'm going to type in the model name and Linux. There was a case last year as I was looking for a computer to build for somebody. There was one that was a really cheap computer. It looked pretty good. The problem is it was so new and had a little bit of an obscure processor that Linux didn't quite yet handle well. And so I chose to give that computer a pass, while I went with another computer that had no problems at all. Now, that computer would work perfectly fine if I threw a distribution that moves faster on it, like Arch Linux. We'll get to that in a moment. But as far as looking at your hardware, you do want to plan a little bit more. You want to think about what you're trying to do a little bit more. One of these has classically been, although even this is getting better in Linux, classically graphics drivers. NVIDIA did not play well with Linux for a long time. It is playing well now. In some instances, it's playing much better. Some instances, it's not as much. But ultimately, if you are dedicating yourself to run Linux, unless you have a very, very good reason, you should probably use AMD graphics instead of NVIDIA, especially if you're going with an older, more stable system like Debian that may not be caught up with all of the drivers and things like that. However, even Debian is making some changes to allow newer hardware in their systems. So again, these are kind of becoming moot points. But when it comes down to hardware, there are actually places where you can test hardware. So this is linux-hardware.org. And what you can do over here is pick your Linux distribution. You can see I selected Linux Mint. That's generally the one I recommend people go to. This has all of your major distributions. Here's MX Linux on the list. You can't see my pop-up window there. My apologies. But if you click that little button down there, there's a whole lot of them. So let me just check all of the ones that I use. Here's Endeavor OS. This is the one that I use for my media PC. Debian OS. There's your basic Arch Linux. So there's you basically start by selecting your Arch, and then they have 9,944 tested, spec'd out computer models. So you could come over here and you can look at what the hardwares are. So here's, for example, an Acer A0756. And when you look over here, there's some probes. Let's just click on this one here. This isn't a site I use a whole lot, but just having a look at everything, we'll just see everything works. This was your sound audio was detected. This is detected. So you can basically see, oh, something's malfunctioning. What is this? There's something with a battery that this is malfunctioning. What does that say? The battery capacity is under 30%. So that might be something you look into, maybe see around. Is that an issue or not? I don't know. That's the type of thing you can do, though. You can also use the site to just say, let's look for individual parts. You can search for a part. So here's an AMD. Let's just click on AMD and see what we have. So this is just kind of a generic. So Here's a variety of different devices. So let's say we find some card we want to do, and then we can see what's going on here. So you can see that this is found in two Pavilion, HP Pavilion computers, and it is detected as working. So that means that things are working well. So you can test hardware on this. This is, as I said, not a site that I use a lot. Just be aware the site exists if you do need to know a little bit about hardware going forward. And so with that, there's your hardware considerations. The second is the software differences. So there is funny, actually, I had a note here to grab it. I forgot to grab it though, but there's a really old video that you can watch. And it was a college student that had to get a new computer and didn't know the difference on any of these things. And this is going back 15 years ago. And she ends up buying an Ubuntu computer instead of a Windows computer for college because it was like $50 cheaper and she didn't really know the difference on all these things. So she goes to college, and the article is so hilarious because it's like she had to drop out of college because the computer wouldn't run her software. And the software they're trying to run is the .exe software to run the modem, which baffled me even to this day. It's a modem. It doesn't need your computer to work. It's supposed to work without your computer. But she had to drop out of school because the modem software didn't work from Comcast. And so, whatever. It was a really hilarious victim mentality video about a woman who had to drop out of college because she got Ubuntu on her computer. You don't want to run into that case and drop out of life because you got Ubuntu on your system, okay? Ubuntu's not my cup of tea, but it is a fine Linux distribution. Go ahead and try it if you want to. But the difference is that she's trying to run a .exe file, and a .exe file is a Windows application. So, of course, .exe and .msi are your two big Windows installation applications, either executables or installation files. Mac runs a .dmg file, which is kind of hilarious. It's, how do you say it? It's a damage file. Wait, what? I don't want to damage my Mac. All right. But on Linux, you first and foremost, you have what would be called repository software. And repository software, this is stuff that the developer of your distribution has vetted and put into the packages. So whereas on Windows, at least classically, you'd go out onto the internet and find an application, or you might go to the local store like a Staples or Walmart, browse the software section, and you'd buy a piece of software and you take it home and put the installation disks in and run it. Of course, now in modern iterations, we have a Windows Store, just like we have an Apple Store, and the app stores we're used to on our phone, where you can go in and you can say, I'm going to pick up this application. You click it. It's either a free download or you purchase it, and then the software gets installed in your system. So once again, Windows has caught up. They now have a store on the system where you can buy the stuff without going to an external retailer or downloading it from the internet. Linux has done this forever. It was the original model. Linux has a ton of software inside of it, and it will have a software installer where you can go on and find the applications. Now, in some instances, you will find the exact same applications. Nearly every web browser that is available on Windows or Mac is available on Linux. I'm not sure there's a Safari for Linux, but there is an Edge for Linux. There is a Chrome for Linux. There is a Firefox for Linux. All of these web browsers, as far as your email clients, a lot of your applications, there is a Linux version of the software. Now, the way of doing the repository system is slowly moving a little out of vogue, although it is still my favorite way to do it. I think it's the best, most cohesive. It's also the smallest size to download and install. But there are other package systems as well inside of Linux. So one of those, and this was kind of the way you could package an older application without it being in the repository. This is really before the modern iteration of the snaps, flatpaks, and app images we will talk about here in a moment. But Deb versus RPM. So these are package systems that are external to the repository that you would download install onto your system, and then this would allow a software package to work. So the .deb is a package filing system for Debian type systems. .rpm was one for the Red Hat type systems. So if you're running Debian or Ubuntu or Linux Mint, things like that, you'd use a .deb package. If you're using a Fedora or you're using a Red Hat or even an OpenSUSE, a Manjaro, you might use the .rpm. Not sure. Manjaro is Arch. Arch can handle both of them, but you have to deal with those independently. You kind of have the choice as to which one you're doing. But this does allow you to install applications that are not in the repository with a package. There's instructions about how to do that. Of course, many distributions, you just double click it and there's a tool in there. A good example of this is Zoom. If I go over here into the Zoom download section, which they're making harder to find, but you choose your Linux type distribution. So, of course, here's Ubuntu, Debian, Linux Mint, Oracle, CentOS, Red Hat. If I choose a Debian, you'll see that it gives us the option for a deb download. If you download this, it's a .deb file. If I were to choose Fedora, however, you'll see that this will change to a .rpm. So this is one of the things that you would look for. If you're doing a Fedora, you'd use a .rpm. If you're doing an Ubuntu, you use a .deb. Now, all this could possibly be moot because this is still an older, more legacy way of doing software. What is more popular now is snaps, flatpaks, and app images. These allow you to run software on your computer without it being in the repository, but also having a degree of safety and auditing that you don't necessarily get with the .deb and .rpms. Now, there is a little bit of controversy, and we're going to avoid the controversial things. I've talked about this in detail. Some people love snaps. Some people hate snaps. Some people love flatpaks. Some people hate them. And app images are over here watching the article, just watching the fight back and forth, yet everyone is kind of ignoring them, which is kind of sad. But anyway, what these are is Snap was put together by the Ubuntu team, and this is a means of installing software onto your system through basically an alternative store. It's not the repository for the distribution. It is an external store, which means any Linux distribution can install that store. And so the thing we got with snaps and flatpaks is you have one system that can run on any Linux distribution. It doesn't matter if it's Ubuntu or Fedora or Debian or Linux Mint. It doesn't matter. Because all of these distributions generally can be set up to use either Snap and or Flatpak. So the big controversy about Snap is the distribution is centralized and proprietary. For the people moving to Linux to get away from big tech companies, they don't like that. For the people who use Linux because it's useful for development, they don't care. And that's really what the gist of the argument is. As far as Flatpaks, this is effectively a very similar thing as Snap, except it is not centralized and it is not proprietary in their distribution. Anybody can create a Flatpak repository. You can put as many or as few applications in there. You can audit them as much or as little as you want, which means that Flatpak could be a little bit more dangerous, although Snap has had some dangerous controversies as well. But these are two ways of distributing software to all Linux distributions, and the same package will, in theory, be the same on every single system. And so Snap and Flatpak, there's a lot of discussions and debates. I would recommend, if you're trying out Linux, make sure you're using a distribution that supports one or the other of these. Manjaro supports both of them with a simple toggle switch. Linux Mint focuses on Flatpaks and actually actively blocks snaps for some philosophical reasons. Ubuntu and many Ubuntu-based distributions, except for Linux Mint, do run snaps by default. And so that is a neat thing to know about your software. Additionally, though, app images. So app images is another way of doing your packaging. These are more standalone, but there is no real good central hub. This might be the best. This is appimagehub.com, which has collected a lot of different software out there. Now, we see here the Perplexity app app. And I chose the Perplexity app because it has a lot of options here. If you go to download this, you'll see that you can download, in this case, the DMG file. We talked about that for the Mac. You see the EXE file we talked about for the Windows, but we also have this app image. So an app image can run on most, if not all, most Linux systems, and it is a completely standalone application that you can run without installing anything. It doesn't get its tendrils through the system, and it's easy to remove if you don't want it. So you have the option here to download app images. If you're looking at an application that has an app image, you could grab this as a standalone. This would be very similar to on Linux. On Windows, there are what are called portable applications. So a portable application would be a .exe where all of the files need to run it. On Windows, they were called DLL files, dynamic library, I think, something like that. Those files were all inside the folder with the exe, so you could run the application on Windows without installing it to your system. So there was no connection into the menu of Windows, but you could open it from a folder on your desktop. App images effectively run the same way. They don't install themselves on your system. You can run them from anywhere that they happen to be at, and you can very cleanly and very easily remove them. So that is another way of running your software. So that is your software considerations. The next thing we want to consider here is file systems, because file systems are a little bit different. So a file system at its core on the basic level is, how does the disk in your computer manage the files? And you may not even think about this, but there are hundreds of ways of doing this. In fact, Linux has so many of them that here's just an article dedicated to them. Here's the ext file system, ext2. You can see these are all, every bullet point item here is a different file system. Here is a little list of them, and they'll tell you some of the character. Whoa, wrong button. I'll do this one. So these are just some of the most popular ones. Btrfs is used in modern Fedora systems. Some Linux distributions are moving towards this. ext4 is generally what I personally use. There's another one called ZFS that's not even on this list. That's popular. But there's just a ton of different systems. They have a lot of different properties. So if you notice back here, these are the Btrfs is the last one, ext4 is second to last one. This is the file size. So these can have files up to 16 gigabytes to 16 terabytes in size, whereas the original sizes were only 2 gigabytes. So the file system might determine things like this. Now, the other thing that your file system determines, however, is if you are using a system, like if you say, I'm testing out Linux, but I want to keep my Windows or my Mac system in place, and you need to transfer files back and forth. Now, if you're using some network server like Google Drive or OneDrive or something like that, it's okay. You transfer files up to there on the one, you log in to that same device on the other computer, you can pull your files down. But if you're doing it locally, like on a USB drive or something like that, then you have to choose for that USB drive a file type, a file system that is compatible between both systems. So this person over here on Unix and Linux asks this question. I use Linux and Mac OS on a regular basis. Sometimes I have to use Windows. I need to use a flash drive on all three. I need a file system that works well on all of them. None of EXTs work on Mac or Windows, which is true. HFS doesn't work on Windows or well on Linux. That's like an Apple one. Of course, there's a new is an Apple file system, AFST. I might actually have it. APFS is what it is. That's the Apple file system. NTFS is the Windows system. This is read only on Mac. So, Mac can read it, but they can't write to it. FAT sucks on everywhere, but it works everywhere, but it sucks everywhere. And so, he's basically says, this guy says UDF. I've never heard of UDF. And apparently you need special tools. It is supported on Linux, on Windows after Vista, and on Mac after 9, on many BSDs. But it actually requires special tools to make. And like I said, I've never actually heard of it prior to doing research for the video. What I generally do is FAT32. Now, FAT32 carries with it a limitation that 4 gigabytes is the maximum file size. So if you need to transfer massively large files, it's not going to work. But by and large, every system that can format a USB drive for use can format into FAT32 as long as your file sizes are smaller than 4 gigabytes. Not the whole size of the disk, but as long as the files themselves are smaller than 4 gigabyte, you can do that. There is a maximum size to how big that can be formatted. This says down here, the maximum size depends on the selected cluster. Limits are really from 2 terabytes to 16 terabytes for cluster sizes of 512 to 4 kilobytes for FAT32. So basically that means, if you're doing a drive that's larger than 2 terabytes, FAT32 is not a good solution, but we're talking about USB ports, so not a big deal. So just be aware that if you are still using multiple systems, you need to transfer files. A standard formatted USB drive that you do in Linux to use directly in Linux may not work under Mac and or Windows. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. So there is your file system considerations. The next consideration we need to talk about is not all distros are the same. So for this, I wanted to go ahead and have a look at Distro Watch. Distro Watch is just, it's a very simple website that just gives us some latest Linux news. So what are the latest distributions? So Armbian just came out, KDE Neon, new version of Tails dropped, EasyOS, Tuxedo. So all these are types of things that we see. There's some latest headlines down here. These things are no longer there. They should probably be removed. Here's the latest Linux packages that have updated. So you can see kind of that kind of stuff, latest reviews. Then they have in the middle column here is which Linux distributions have just reached new versions. So the time I'm recording this, Elementary 8, Ubuntu is out, Unihost. I think this one for VoIP, I think. I forget what Romax is. There's Oracle, here's Rocky Linux, Alma Linux, Ghost BSD, Red Hat. So you can see that we have a lot of these. And then over here on the far right is the most popular distributions in the last 6 months. This is not like a scientific poll. This is mostly like user pings, and it does give us an interesting guide. I pulled this in just to talk about a few things. Number one, not all Linux distributions are the same. So you see at this list here, Mint is at the top of the list, MX Linux near the top. Number 3 is Endeavor OS. Number 4 is Debian. Number 5 is Manjaro. 6 Ubuntu, 7 Pop OS, 8 Cashy OS, 9 Fedora, and 10 OpenSUSE. We're going to talk about these real quick. So Ubuntu is a distribution that is a heavily modified version of Debian. Ubuntu is one of the most popular Linux distributions to create distributions out of. The regular version of Linux, Mint, and Pop OS are both Ubuntu-based distributions. Cashy OS, I just did a video on this recently. I forget which base it's on. I'm going to not say much more about it. Fedora is a open source version of Red Hat, and OpenSUSE itself is a different thing. So OpenSUSE, Fedora, and Debian are your like 4 complete different parent families. Manjaro is an Arch-based distribution, and that is that's a separate distribution family as well. So Arch, Debian, Fedora, OpenSUSE would all represent different ways of doing Linux. MX Linux up here is a descendant of Debian, kind of like the same way Ubuntu is a descendant of Debian. And the reason we bring this chart up is just to mention, I've thrown out some words there. If you're testing out Linux for the very first time, I would recommend you do Mint. Linux Mint, do the basic Linux Mint Cinnamon. This is going to work for most people, for most times, most circumstances, and it's a rock solid distribution. This one is generally a lot more stable. It can manage nearly everything from the user interface, meaning you don't need to go into that scary terminal generally at all. Although if you are looking up some things, some issues, some problem creeps up, you might have to find yourself involved in Linux Mint. Not a big deal. So some of these systems are easier to use. Once again, I recommend Linux Mint because it is extremely easy to use. We have a little update indication at the bottom. It tells us which software is available for update. It gives us information and one click to update that software. We have a separate software manager, which allows us to install or remove applications from our system. And by and large, it has a series of tools that are very easy to work with. Now, I use EndeavourOS on one of my main daily use PCs because that runs the Arch system, and that lets me see software I might be running in the future on production machines prior to it reaching my production machine, so I can get used to the changes in the workflows and things like that if a major package has changed. EndeavourOS, while it is a very good distribution, it's probably not one I would give to a new user because there is no package manager on it by default. There's a lot of other things that it can be a lot more difficult. You're going to be in the terminal a lot more on something like that. And if you're not used to the terminal, I like it personally, but if you're not used to it, then it's going to be a little bit of more of a barrier for you if you're just getting started. Some of these systems need more updates. The advantage of Arch is you install it once and you never have to install it again. It is what is called a rolling release. It will constantly update itself, and it updates itself as soon as new packages are available. There's a new version of GNOME drops. Within a week or two, it's going to be on Arch. And if you're running GNOME on Arch, you're going to get that brand new version on Arch. It updates constantly. You will run system updates in the morning and you'll have 25 new system updates in the evening. It is constantly rolling, constantly updating. And if you do not update it at least once a quarter, it's going to be a real big pain and probably break when you go to update it again. So you have to stay on top of it with Arch. Debian is the slowest rolling of the Linux distributions. It maintains its security by patching security fixes very fast. However, it does not roll its software. It does not change its package base, except once every roughly 2 years or so, we get a new version. Okay, Debian is one of the oldest versions of Linux still exists, and we are on version 12 or 13. Okay, whereas Arch is like 675. It's not really that, but you kind of get the point. Debian rolls a lot slower than does Arch. There's different use cases for this. I like the slow rolling distributions. I don't want my software to update a lot because, like Windows, like Mac, like Linux, if you're constantly updating new software, they throw brand new features in the system that don't work for you, you don't want, like, or need. I want my software to never change. It's not uncommon for me to take some production systems, get it the way I want it, keep it off the internet, and never update it for years at a time. It's not uncommon for me to do that. However, my Arch system, Endeavour, that is constantly on the internet, does get regular updates. Some distributions do not allow you to roll to the next version. Elementary OS, which is on top of our page right there, is one of these. If you are running Elementary OS 7 and you want to run the new Elementary OS 8, you have to wipe your system and install 8 over top of the old system and then add your files back in. Linux Mint has a very nice upgrade path. Each older version of Linux Mint can be upgraded to the newer version. Debian has ways to do it. It's a little bit more complicated, but you can do it. Arch, there's never a reason. You just run system updates and it's always the new version. So Arch you never have to touch. So there is some differences between the distributions. Now, as we talked about with hardware earlier, if you are running the latest and greatest hardware, you're going to need to run something Arch-based, or something like Fedora also does a really good job. They roll about every 9 months or so. Ubuntu also does a pretty good job. They roll about every 9 months or so. And so that might be your path to get your latest hardware to work: Fedora, Ubuntu, or Arch. If you are running a little bit older of a system, you'd buy computers like I do. You might go to Best Buy and buy last year's model off the floor sample box to take it home and install Linux on it. I do that all the time. Any distribution will work under that case. So not all distributions are the same. That's something to keep in mind. And our last one we have to talk about is Linux is not just a terminal. We mentioned the word terminal. That is that really scary thing that people say. People have talked about over over the years, and they're like, oh, I don't want to use Linux because it's a terminal. Like what is a terminal? Ah, this is a terminal. Here's a Linux terminal. Look at this. So if I just do ls, here's the listing of all of the things on here right now. And, you know, I could do like an apt update if I wanted to update the system. I could do an apt upgrade if I wanted to upgrade the whole thing. You know, I could see what type of documents I have into here. This is all the terminal type stuff, and that can sometimes be scary and intimidating for some people. By and large, some Linux distributions, you will need to use the terminal more than others. Arch is a good example of that. Things like Linux Mint, you could go weeks, if not months on end without ever looking at the terminal because, ooh, it's a scary thing. Some people still do think that Linux is just a terminal. It is not, and Linux is getting better and better and better at doing things without needing to touch the terminal. Now, the more you use Linux, the more you like, appreciate, and learn the terminal. However, it is still something that you do not have to use in each circumstance. So that is what our ideas are here. So those are our 5 basic things to think about before switching to Linux. Let me know any other questions you have down below. Maybe I'll compile those if we need a part 2 to this video. And if you like this type of content, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. Leave us a like and a comment and tell all your friends about the benefits of switching to Linux. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.